I see people are coming in bit by bit, so I'm going to just give it another minute, and then I'll begin the event. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is William Egginton. I'm the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. Our lecturer, and most importantly, I'm pleased to introduce to you our lecturer, Laura Oulanne, is a postdoctoral researcher in comparative literature at the University of Helsinki and a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University in the Department of Political Science. Her postdoctoral research explores the way modernist women writers create alternatives to internalist and individualist conceptions of the mind and the subject, rewriting the relationship between the human and the environment while challenging the gendered norms of society. So today, she's going to be speaking on the topic of sense-making and selfhood beyond narratives, the case of Gertrude Stein's Ida. So everyone, I am going to pass it over to Laura right now. I'm going to turn off my camera and microphone for the time being and listen to the talk myself. When she's done, and she tells me it's going to be about 45 minutes, I'll come back on and help moderate a discussion of the lecture. I'll be paying attention to the Q&A board, so please put your questions for Laura into the Q&A board, and I will do my best to make sure that all of them get read aloud and responded to, but Laura can see them as well from her end. So without further ado, Laura, welcome to Hopkins, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you, Bill and Shira, for making this talk happen in the first place. Yeah, I've been visiting at Johns Hopkins soon for 2 years already. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Jane Bennett for initiating the idea of this talk and also for inviting me generously to Hopkins in the first place. This feels like a really nice way to slowly start saying goodbye to this period that's been like really inspiring and productive, and well, it's been a more and more interesting period in terms of the world this year. And also maybe, I don't know, I'm going to talk about Gertrude Stein, and maybe some of you know that she went to Hopkins Medical School. So this is like a really nice opportunity to talk about her work in this context, this virtual context of Johns Hopkins University. So yeah, I've been working on a project on Anglophone modernist women and their experiments with the human mind and subject. I've been writing about Juno Barnes, Jean Rhys, Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, and Gertrude Stein, among other writers that are gonna join the project a bit later. So what I want to do here is to focus on Gertrude Stein and to read her novel Ida with you. Oops. There it is. I hope you can see my slides. And explore the ways this novel, this book, reimagines subjectivity with the means of a narrative, but also in the process kind of reconfigures narrativity. The book was originally published in 1941, and I don't know if you can see the text in the picture on the cover of this first edition, Gertrude Stein's first novel in 11 years. I love this book advertising. So this is based on ideas that I've been working on in an article as well. an expansion of them. So on like an obvious level of reading, Ida, I also have a copy here, tells the story of the life of a human individual, Ida, from childhood through a mobile youth, through a series of marriages to what appears to be a final marriage. And the form of the narrative, however, complicates matters, for instance, in that it keeps digressing from Ida's life into these list-like passages whose main goal seems to be to convey geographical information or environmental content about the United States, as well as little vignettes, which also are more or less geographical or environmental, but have nothing really to do with Ida or her biography. So I want to ask how these digressions possibly affect the reading of a story and what kind of sense making the text invites, and thereby ask broader questions about the kind of work this text does in the world and how it might help us think about what narratives in general do or can do in the world, and also about their limitations. I'm suggesting that a text like Ida, which is definitely a narrative, might contribute to and in fact help reimagine some discussions about narrative as a category and a way of making sense of the world, the human self, and the human life, and be conductive actually to some less anthropocentric ways of thinking, and thereby have ethical implications that maybe have not been considered yet. So as you could see, I have the term sense making in my title, and from the question setting, you can already infer that I'm taking a pretty broad approach to what sense making implies, instead of suggesting that literature would help us to like make sense of the world in the sense of fitting it into categories or rationalizing it. I'm more of the view that it generates a specific kind of knowledge literature does that is non-propositional, and it's based on experience, experientiality, and thereby it also relies heavily on the sense experience of the material world, as in through the senses, and the interaction between the text and the reader, which is dynamic and not without tensions, not absolute or total in any way. And I'm interested in how this kind of knowledge can have a special importance in discussing theoretical and philosophical problems. And I'm also interested in how to articulate this kind of beyond languageness in a language of research. So I'll start by briefly charting the aforementioned theoretical questions about narratives, the world, and the self that have motivated this train of thought. And then I'll see how these thematics play out in reading Stein's text. And I like to do close readings of passages, even in a talk or presentation, though I've never done it in this kind of online environment. So we'll see how this goes. So one of the conversations in the background of my reading is about the relationship between the notion of narrativity and the physical world of matter. This material world has become an increasingly important element in literary studies, but there's also a dynamic conversation about how exactly is it possible, how can we encompass materiality and the non-human world and the environment in talking about literature, which seems like a very human phenomenon. So in their influential contribution to material ecocriticism, which is one of the most central current approaches that bring in materiality and the environment and challenge anthropocentrism in literary studies, Serena Iovino and Gertrude Opperman have harnessed the notion of narrativity to show that non-human matter is not beyond such intuitively human categories as stories and to this way grant matter a specific kind of agency. And this is how they formulate the central argument of their collections, which is simply called material ecocriticism. The world's material phenomena are knots in a vast network of agencies, which can be read in inverted commas and interpreted as forming narratives, stories. Oh, there's a typo. Developing in bodily forms and in discursive formulations and arising in co-evolutionary landscapes of natures and science, the stories of matter are everywhere. In the air we breathe, the food we eat, in the things and beings of this world, within and beyond the human realm. All matter, in other words, is a storied matter. This is really important in that they recognize the presence of the non-human world within such a human category as narrative, and we could almost leave it at that. However, this approach also has its issues, which have been pointed out, especially in later conversations around narratology and the non-human world. For instance, recently Juha Raipola argues the problem with the idea of storied matter, as they put it, is that even with this conceptual expansion, narrative remains a very human-centered way of making sense of the world and simply cannot encompass many phenomena of the natural world, which tend to be emergent and involve things like complex systems that just have no characteristics of narrative, and this is how he puts it. When approached through narrative logic, a major part of the complex entanglements of human and non-human agencies is ultimately lost and ignored. Thus, this kind of agency might be termed as semiotic agency or meaning-producing agency, but identifying it as narrative agency seems like a definite misnomer. Outside the most metaphoric use of the term, material things are not telling their own stories to anyone, but are simply behaving in a way that can be interpreted as a story or several stories. So Raipola's point is that the material world behaves in such complex ways that it tends to surpass any kind of narrativization and make it more like a gesture of imposing a human category on something that doesn't fit in it, even if it's fair to say that the material world does have agency and does produce meaning. Seeing emergent phenomena such as climate change, for instance, or the development of species as a narrative risks ignoring some of their central characteristics because they simply do not fit any definition of narrative, which leads us to ask what exactly are the definitions of narrative. And I can't go very far into this sort of endless conversation, but maybe it's helpful to look at some. So here's a famous one to start with. So for some like Ian Forster, narrative is primarily a question of form and structure defined by sequentiality of events and, importantly, causality between them. So Forster writes, the king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. So both are accepted within narrativity, and then there is this addition of causality in the plot. In more contemporary discussions, others like James Phelan define narrative primarily in terms of communication and rhetorics. So in Phelan's definition, narrative is somebody telling somebody else on some occasion for some purpose that something happened. And for further others, like David Herman, the defining factor is experience. So it's more a cognitive point of view. And he says it's something about what happened to particular people and what it was like to experience what happened. In all these cases, it seems that there is an assumption of humanness, right? Even though causality can be observed in non-human phenomena, as we sort of saw, it is still a human concept. And like Raipola, for instance, argues, a lot of the non-human natural world doesn't actually follow such laws. The rhetorical definition And second definition assumes a human somebody, as there is a purpose to telling, and it might be hard to argue that non-human matter would have that kind of intentionality. And Herman even mentions people, and experience, of course, implies humanness, sort of, although I can reveal that this maybe counterintuitively is a definition that I will sort of keep closest to what I am proposing here. So how should we talk about the meaningfulness of the material world if it's not narrative? And or should we even? Because there's an alternative that seems to be implicit in the criticism of the account of storied matter that leans in the direction of approaches like thing theory and object-oriented ontology, which would involve claiming that material things resist all experience, all understanding, all intrusion by human language. But I can't really embrace this approach either, especially as I'm supposed to talk about literature, but also about the lived world, because this idea of a receding, recalcitrant, resistant world actually seems to imply a kind of human exceptionalism, in that the whole point here is to avoid, because when the world of non-human things is imagined like this, shut away from us, we may grant this world some sort of independence, but we ignore the senses in which we too are material beings in the world, and we're embedded and actually permeated by non-human elements. So there's none, I don't want to see this clear distinction between the two worlds. So this is another long conversation we can't really go into here, but it motivates me to look for another direction. If we start with literature, I would say that references to material things, as we'll see soon in Ida, certainly do play a part in stories in many ways. And not all of them are completely anthropocentric. I want to pay attention to the way material elements in stories invite both affective and interpretive sense making. And it seems intuitive that setting them completely outside of our grasp risks fetishizing them and celebrating and like an unproductive separation between human and material, like I said. So the kind of materialist and affective reading, well, that I want to do is of course influenced by approaches to both the world and stories, such as the vital materialism that Jane Bennett has so influentially written about, which are capable of viewing matter as both agentive, independent, and alive, apart from human movers, but also effective and networked with other, including human agencies, and ourselves as part of this vibrant world. And this also resonates with her new work on the Whitmanian porous self in a state of flux. What I hope to show here is that reading liveliness in the non-human material world also changes how we read human life and human selves. And this is very interesting in Stein's case, which, before moving on to Stein, brings us to the other theoretical conversation about narrative that I want to evoke here briefly before we get there. And interestingly, this discussion hasn't really overlapped with the first discussion about material agency and narrativity, storied matter, but it might fruitfully do so. So this is the debate about the narrativity of lives and selves. So there's a long tradition in different disciplines of seeing subjectivity and a meaningful life as something that forms a coherent narrative, either naturally or more often as a result of the individual, of the subject's construction work. So famous, but this has also been criticized a lot lately. Famous example is philosopher Galen Strawson's essay, I Am Not a Story, in which he writes against the narrativist view that we I quote, a story ourselves, consciously or unconsciously, and that this is in fact a good thing. So he claims it's not a good thing, and not all people do that. Furthermore, for instance, neurolinguists have criticized narrativist approaches to life histories and the experience of self for the way they detach selves from the sociocultural context and ignore the sense of self that is maintained, even when sequentiality and coherence of a life story might be broken in case of neurological trauma, for instance. Here's Maria Medved and Jens Brockheimer on this topic. The narrativist approach decontextualizes self-narratives from three essential areas or aspects of the living reality of human beings: the intersubjective context in which all stories are told, the larger autobiographical context that is behind all self-narratives, which includes one's life history, and the sociocultural context, which includes the social environments in which narrators share their lives with others. And this quote might be continued to note that what definitely escapes a narrativist definition of life is the context of environments in which narrators share their lives with non-human others. In any case, combining this critique with the critique of storied matter and the theory of storied matter in the first place, it seems that non-human nature and life refuse to be storied, but so does the human. It seems clear that when talking about either, we need more complex understanding than any definition of narrative that we've so far seen can yield, even if the normative demand of coherence that Medved and Brockheimer here are writing against is removed. So as a literary scholar, I engage with narratives all the time. And even though I agree with all of these criticisms, I think that as a form of art, there's more to narratives than any of these theoretical approaches quite grasp. And furthermore, quite a lot of literary narratives overtly experiment with ways of reimagining causality, coherence, sequentiality, and conventions and expectations of telling, even though I do remain here with Herman's definition that they all will include some kind of dimension of what is it like, but we'll see how this plays out in Stein's case. So this is key to what I want to read in Ida here. I want to claim that literary fiction, instead of or besides reinforcing rigid categories of narrativity and imposing them on reality, can invite different forms of sense making that are more in tune with the networked and distributed affectivity of the world. And it can create experiential understanding of the what is it like kind of things that seem to fall completely out of the sphere of human and conventional narrative sense making. And finally, according to Timothy Morton, literature that tunes into the environment can explore and construct alternative ideas of subjectivity. So he says, subjectivity is not simply an individual and certainly not just an individualist phenomenon. It is a collective one. Environmental writing is a way of registering the feeling of being surrounded by others, or more abstractly by an otherness, something that is not the self. And I want to go a bit further and expand this kind of trust in literature to a text that does not really fall within the definition that Morton has for environmental literature, and that seems at first to have very little to do with any kind of internal experience or feeling. To argue that this kind of enhanced proximity of selfhood with otherness need not be the explicit aim of a literary text to take effect in the event of reading one. And this is where Ida comes in. So, as I said, the novel has the overall structure of narrating the life of a woman, the places she lives in, the people she meets, etc. And the book even has a potential real life referent that would really make it an exercise in biography. It's been suggested that Wallis Simpson, later Duchess of Windsor, who became an international celebrity when England's King Edward VIII, I think so, gave up his crown to marry her. Of course, he had to do that because she was divorced and they couldn't get married. Because of that she is the inspiration for the novel and its main character, who also goes through a series of marriages to settle down with Andrew, the final husband, who also seems to be some kind of royal person. But in spite of all this, the novel is explicitly playing with the ideas of self-narration and life narration, beginning with the name of its main character, as has been pointed out, that it is pointing towards identity and playing with that. And there's also things like the theme of a twin. Ida comes up or like invents a twin for herself. And then there is the biographical story combined with the general fragmentariness and repetitiveness and all these list elements. In addition to these, well, yeah, and including these lists, digressions that I have mentioned. And a lot of researchers, especially with different post-structuralist approaches, have noted these traits and suggested that Stein's texts in general challenge or deconstruct the human or humanist subject. But what hasn't really been discussed in detail is the environmental and material elements that contribute to these deconstructive moves. So the movement of the discourse away from the human subject and towards non-human world and environments, from biography to geography, sort of, and the way this affects the reading of the book as the story of a life. And when looking at this with the help of some quotes from the text, I want to keep in mind the other question that I started with. So are these examples of, in Strawson's words, unstoried life, but also in Iovino and Opperman's words, storied matter? Or is it something else? So yeah, let's look at quotes to find out. The novel is divided in two halves, and in the first one, there's a third person, in both, there's a third person narrator who relates what happens to Ida, but in the first part, before she meets Andrew, which mostly means reporting her movements around the United States and a little in Great Britain as well. And here's an example of both the content and of the style. Like everybody, Ida had lived not everywhere, but she had lived in quite a number of houses and in a good many hotels. It was always natural to live anywhere she lived, and she soon forgot the other addresses. Anybody does. So even though this is the story of Ida, she's brought forth as an anybody who is like everybody. The narrator also does not specify or describe her abodes beyond houses and hotels. Also, the narrator rarely describes the locations Ida inhabits or visits, and doesn't really refer to her experiences of, well, what was it like there, which makes it hard to call this environmental writing, and it kind of puts the experientiality in a difficult place as well. However, general information is provided in abundance, as we can see in another typical passage in the text, especially its first half. She went from Washington to Wyoming, from Wyoming to Virginia, and then she had the kind of feeling she had never been in Washington, although of course she had, and she went there again. So the focus of passages like this is on events whose eventness, or at least the agency behind them, seems debatable, even though there is a mention of feeling. But there is mostly just turning up or happening to live in one place and then another, while none of these changes really appear as a strong disruption caused by a human individual acting out the course of her life in the world, but rather as the natural state of affairs. And I'd say that because of this distancing effect that remains vague about experience, the text foregrounds Ida as a textual agent. And this is also underscored by things such as the alliteration or quasi-alliteration in this passage, for instance, in Wyoming, Virginia, Washington, as if it's the sonic qualities of the text itself that they directed the movement of its heroine from state to state instead of her human intentions. So what does this kind of storytelling deny readers, and what does it enable? Ida seems to give us actions, but not the means to use narrative as kind of a folk psychological tool to make sense of the world or selfhood through experience. And this presents the readers with a cognitive challenge that could also maybe be seen as a positive one, to make new connections and maybe rely on a more networked practice of modeling human behavior in conjunction with the world, rather than one based on coherence or causality. And let's look at another passage that has a clearer dynamic of what I was mentioning earlier about a story and then digression. Ida really coughed. She had that kind of health. In New England, there are 6 states: Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Ida turned up in Connecticut. She was living there quite naturally, quietly living there. So here we move abruptly from a description of a character's health, which is kind of close to human experience, to a list of states in New England, which is very informative. Thank you. And then on to another like non-event kind of explanation of turning up somewhere. The list interrupts the flow of the narrative that we expect would move from the description of a human subject to the narration of a human life event. And the impersonality of this list points away from the main character, and the narrative passage about Connecticut that follows maintains some of this distance. Again, it states that her being there was a natural occurrence. No environments are described. If there's a sense of presence produced by the state names, which I think there is, it relies on the materiality of the linguistic unit, which is not immaterial in itself. And this, I'd say, creates an alternative space that is non-narrative and in both experiential and sequential senses. And this anti-narrative logic is extended to the relating of Ida's actions. And then she, as a subject too, is sort of disconnected from narrative definitions. So it seems like the story creates a kind of material agency in place of a human agency, but it seems to be above all the agency of linguistic units. And 2 more passages exemplify this. We'll read them too. Then suddenly, not at all suddenly, they were sent there. He was in the army. They got up and had decided to leave for Ohio. Yesterday or today, they would leave for Ohio. When they got to Ohio, Ohio is a state. It is only spelled with 4 letters. All of a sudden, they were in Ohio. There they were in Ohio, sorry. And the other quote, after Ida left Texas, she did not live in the country. She lived in the city. She lived in Washington. That is the way it went on. Washington is a city, and a city, well, a city is, well, it is a city. Ida lived there. So here the surprising general information is like meta-linguistic. In the first quote, the explanation about the spelling of Ohio interrupts, again, the narrative sequence, which is already all over the place in terms of temporality, for instance. And it interrupts it with information that doesn't directly relate to the experience of being in Ohio or even events that occur there. And in the second quote, we have the repetitive chain that is Stein's trademark. You might know this, a rose is a rose, etc., which is likely distracting and uninformative for readers looking for events or reasons or experiences related to being in Washington. These passages can also be seen as a parody of the Forsterian story, for instance, recalling the definitions earlier. First this happened, and then suddenly that happened for that reason. The place names seem to have a life of their own as textual elements and their imaginary reference, but not really as locations for human activity and experience in the narrative. So Ohio is spelled with only 4 letters, and Ida is in Ohio, and both come across as states of things in the world, and it's not clear which one we should find more interesting. And thereby, Ida once again becomes something like a grammatical subject or a geographical one, like Ohio, which the logic of the novel displaces a little from the realm of narrativity. But so how can we talk about this text as life writing? We might recall, just really quickly, different kinds of definitions for life, as in the conversation of bios and Zoe. This have been brought up by Georgia Agamben and Rosie Braidotti, for instance. So bios is the good or cultured life of human society, something that biography also implies, even though it also implies biology. While Zoe is a central post-human concept, and it signifies non-human life as a process, cyclic process of different becomings, and refuses to be contained within the straight lines of human thinking. And this Braidotti draws on the Deleuzian notion of a life in the singular, indefinite singular, which, especially in the sense that also Jane Bennett has used it, I find even more applicable here because it doesn't imply a distinction between natural and artificial or cultural elements or environments or matter. So I said, Ida isn't really lingering on environmental descriptions of living nature and therefore like celebrating something like Zoe. But yet there's this sense of an impersonal, immanent force acting in and upon and between human and non-human bodies alike. And then there's this linguistic agency that brings all this forward. So to get back to narrative structure in the sense of especially sequentiality, causality, human experience, and arguably also communication between the narrator and the narrative. Like, why are we given these informative lists? Is disturbed by these digressions. But I'd also like to suggest that a sense of self and a sense of experience related to it is maintained in spite of all this, in the way the text offers us the abundant series of examples of life happening and places existing, even if it's very impersonal and very imprecise. And therefore, if this is the story of a self and a life, the self is not of a storied and narrative kind, nor is it exclusively human. Rather, it is somehow extending, distributed all over the map of the United States, as well as into the textual forms used to evoke it. In that, the text invites us readers to see agents, or which the text invites readers to see as agents in their own right. But this, I would say, further is not a case of storied matter, if you recall the ecocritical definition, either as the sense-making that the environmental, or more precisely geographical and grammatical presences in the text invite, is not of a narrative kind, unless we come up with another definition of narrative that is only about, or adds at least, affective elements, examples of a life interacting with one another and with the reader. But I'm not just suggesting really that we do that, but only that we recognize that something like this is a large part of what happens in reading texts, even more conventional than Ida, and that in Ida this becomes something that the text plays with. And it becomes here more apparent because the text turns away from more traditionally understood narrative forms. So as a final few examples to examine what I mean by this distributed sense of self, I look at some there is phrases, which is another recurring form in the novel. These are also interesting because these actually involve some minimal description of environments. Here's Ida's first husband, who comes from Montana. "Oh dear," he said, "it is lovely in Montana. There are mountains in Montana, and the mountains are very high." And just then he looked up and he saw them, and he decided, it was not very sudden, he decided he would never see Montana again, and he never did. He went away from Montana and he went to Virginia. There he saw trees and he was so pleased. So there's some human agency. The man sees mountains and decides, and he sees trees and he's pleased. However, these experiences are impersonal, again, kind of general, and psychological causes and intentions remain pretty obscure and arbitrary. And again, the story seems to be driven by prosody, seas, trees, pleased, mountains, Montana, these connections, rather than by the choices and actions of characters. So mountains, environmental things like mountains, trees, rivers are evoked as something lively and imaginable as environmental forms, yet still the experience is not of being in a place. What is it like to be there as a human being, but sort of this multiplicity of places, environments, things being there. Furthermore, they're not here, they're not quite available for the reader's experience, but they still remain a presence of otherness, maybe not completely out of reach either, as they are part of the sequence of reading, and that is affecting the readers in one way or another, even without information about what it was like for fictional characters. So ontologically, the text brings the fictional human subject and the places closer to the same level. Both are there, quietly and naturally, as Stein likes to say, in the text and in the world. And this there is structure has actually been studied in relation to environmental poetics by Morton, who draws on Levinas's essay on the same title. And I think it's interesting to briefly look at the original in Levinas's writings in conjunction with Stein's here. So this is what he writes. "There is in general, without it mattering what there is, without our being able to fix a substantive to this term. There is an impersonal form, like it rains or it is warm. Its anonymity is essential. The mind does not find itself faced with an apprehended exterior. The exterior, if one insists on this term, remains uncorrelated with an interior. The disappearance of all things and of the I leaves what cannot disappear, the sheer fact of being, in which one participates, whether one wants or not, without having taken the initiative anonymously." So for Levinas, the notion of a world always denotes a world of objects already possessed by the experience of the subject, whereas the there is construction removes this personal and interior dimension. However, elsewhere, Levinas also notes that art can extract a thing from the perspective of the world, quote, to bring about something unobjectified and even unnamed that still remains a material presence. And we could argue that Stein's there is structures, even if they are a practice of naming, do precisely this, and that this indeed could be a quality of not only her, but of other literary works as well. So no text can tell us about something that happened to some human body for some purpose and about what it was like, without also showing us what there was, what there is. Sometimes they're quite happy to only do the latter, like Ida. And final, there is example, we get back to the meta level of stories and language. That's as Stein brings in another use of there is in a beginning of a fairy tale. Once upon a time there was. So these are a sequence in the text. Duncan never did leave Texas except once when he went to Tennessee. But by that time, he never wanted to leave Texas. No use saying that he only remembered Ida, because he didn't. Once upon a time, there was a meadow, and in this meadow was a tree, and on this tree there were nuts. The nuts fell, and when they plowed the ground, and the nuts were plowed into the ground, but they never grew out. So the tree appears from nowhere, kind of to interrupt the narrative of Duncan, who is someone Ida talks to when in Texas, and apparently not a very important person in her story. And subsequently, the tree and the nuts, the plowers, and Duncan disappear into the same nowhere, and another part of the story begins. However, once a reader has read this mini tale in the middle of this novel, it will have joined the catalog, sort of a cognitive catalog of places and environments that the story has evoked. And it has affected the reader and the story, and inserted some more environmental content, another form of a life, or in this case, definitely Zoe kind of life, into the biographical whole. So that's the recalling Levinas, the impersonal form of Ida's there is, seems to encompass human characters and named places, as well as environmental forms and events. It seems like instead of receding and escaping the reader, such structure reaches towards things without predetermining them as objects. And crucially, in the logic of this text, Ida herself appears as an example of an impersonal life, a life in the indefinite singular. Like the pronoun in Levinas is one participates in passive. Furthermore, as the novel foregrounds its own form, the material of language is made part of this material world. But differing from Levinas's kind of this horror mode of at the persistent fact of being, Stein's there is actually usually comes with this tender comical tone, especially in the latter part of the work that I haven't really had the chance to quote from here. This form coexists with affective and affirmative expressions such as a repeated yes, or an all-encompassing dear, as in Dear Ida, but also Dear Montana, Dear Madison, Dear Wisconsin, that are repeated in the text. So this is like a concretely encompassing or embracing agency in these linguistic gestures, and the repetitions also include in this embrace sort of linguistic and narrative elements that the text tenderly asks the reader to accept that they are there. So to sum up, we've seen how Ida breaks sequentiality and causality that are attached to narratives and potentially to lives and selves. It distributes experientiality all over the place and confuses readers looking for a clear communicative purpose or message. And on the basis of my reading, it seems that the idea that narrativity in these senses, for instance, would be needed to bring matter closer to human sense-making subjectivity and life is problematic, because it assumes that these phenomena, namely human sense-making subjectivity and life, are themselves more narrative and maybe more human than might be necessary. And the element of experientiality, though, or experience, remains part of this reading. Reading this text, only we don't always need to know what something was like for a human surrogate experiencer, human character. It seems like in our reading about a human life, there are a lot of non-human elements at play, but this does not make the reading distant or objective. Maybe looking at language as crucially material in itself could be key for some kind of shift in thinking towards flatter ontologies and a broader definition of narrativity, as well as life, because it exposes a connection that is there already between life, selfhood, material agency, and linguistic sense-making, without us imposing unnecessarily rigid narrative categories on any of them. More broadly, what I think the value of reading and discussing and experimental texts such as Ida is that it can complicate the idea of narratives themselves and bring forward the idea of literature as a potential space to imagine and crucially reimagine. That's not just proposing things and events, but rather showing us something and making us live through something and exposing us to the fact that we can live through affective patterns that do not follow the habitual forms that we picture when faced with concepts such as life story, life events, for instance. It pays to be critical of narratives, but also it's to remember that as art, narratives can do so much more than we maybe remember. So I'd like my reading to rather expand the faith in some kind of affirmative political potential in literature than to make us completely wary of anything resembling a story, even though that is sort of the critical point where we started. And in the spirit of affirmation, to end, I want to follow a very conventional narrative sequence, an arc, and finish with the final words of the novel, which, as I said, turns more and more affirmative towards its ending. And overtly, these words only refer to Ida and Andrew, who have happily found one another. But they can also be read as a gesture addressing a potentially infinite list of characters, places, things, which are not tied to a sequence or personal experience or a self, but regardless can be sensed as a presence in the reading. They are there. Thank them. Yes. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. This is, of course, the time when your a room full of participants would be clapping and thanking you for your work. We don't hear that nowadays, but hopefully you can imagine it, because I'm sure it's happening on the other side of these screens. So let me remind everyone, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You should type in your questions for me. And while you're doing that, in the meantime, I might start off the conversation, Laura, by first of all, I thought your talk was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the perspectives that you opened up, and a little bit of the kind of critical agonistic approach you were taking towards some of the voices at the beginning, that you come around and offer a sort of stalwart defense of some kind of power of narrative in light of some of the critiques that you mentioned at the very beginning. And in that light, I wanted to share the experience of reading some of these passages with you of Gertrude Stein that reminded me in a I want to say narrative or perhaps poetic vein in Gertrude Stein's work of what one of her contemporaries, and in some ways even geographical contemporaries, since Buñuel I'm referring to was also in Paris a lot of the time, was certainly a fellow traveler at that point, that in particular in some of his later films, but even in the early work with Dali, and Jane, having just recently taught wild surrealism or surrealism herself, will perhaps also want to reflect on this. But Buñuel would develop a methodology, a technique with the camera that I'm reminded of when I read some of Gertrude Stein's sentences with you, or hear you read them out loud, which is this idea that the camera in the case of Buñuel, or the narrative line of the sentence in the case of Stein, seems to be following a kind of narrative purpose, by which I mean a diachrony, right? Oh, this is the purpose of the film, the story. We're going along from beginning to middle to end. And in both cases, in the case of the filmmaker, he would have instances where the camera, someone is following someone else, an incidental character, not a character at all, would cross the path of the character. The camera vacillates for a moment, doesn't know where to go, and then suddenly follows the path of the person crossing. And then you hear the main character's voice sort of drifting off as the camera just goes in the wrong direction. And this, in so many ways, strikes me as this kind of distracted narrative voice in Gertrude Stein, where she'll suddenly, her voice, we'll call it the voice, gets caught up in the sound of something, and it just sort of hovers and stays with it for a little bit, or goes off and discusses the number of letters in the word Ohio. So you have this idea in some ways, one of the agents or potential agents that we don't usually think of as being an agent, a camera in a film, or the line of words itself in a book, develop a kind of agency of their own. So a kind of liveliness or life or agency pops up where you wouldn't necessarily assume there is one or should be one, right? So I guess what I'm suggesting is that the narrative itself, or this storied narrative itself, can kind of take on a storied matter, namely the matter of the words themselves start to develop a kind of agency where you wouldn't necessarily expect them to, as another form of the power that Stein inserts in words.
Yes, that's a great comparison, and I hadn't thought of that. And I was just thinking that it's something like that I could continue towards from here, because like it's interesting to look at Ida as a narrative, and like through these categories of narrativity, and see how it breaks them, but then also just borrowing from other arts, like film is a narrative art too, but like the ways of expression in film, for instance, there's something more there, and like looking for comparisons, and also, like you mentioned, poetics, like using different terminology in an even more positive way to look at, well, what does this text do, and like what kind of, like you put it, agency the narrator has, would, I think, be really interesting.
And also,
and like visuality in general. Yeah, sorry.
And also, and a questions coming in that I want to go to, but also just to follow up, it was also a thought that I was having, very much in lines with the kind of eco-critical approach or geo-critical approach that you're abutting or suggesting or working with. A thought that occurred to me is, even in a at this point, kind of in the vein of, or in the lights of, a traditional structuralist poetics of understanding what Jacobson would refer to as the poetic function of language, the whereby the what you could call the synchronic axis, or the axis of selection, is projected upon the axis of combination. What's interesting there, of course, is that the synchronic axis is also the axis in language that's most associated with space and place. So a poetic function in some ways becomes also a geopoetic function by reference to different spaces and different places. And that's what occurred to me when hearing the first passages you were quoting from in Stein, where suddenly we have these states, right? She there even that, exactly, the one with the states, or she had that kind of health. In New England there are 6 states, and then suddenly what had been a temporal diachronic narrative very literally turns and becomes spatial and heads out into different spaces. But this is happening all the time, apparently, in this book. There's a kind of obsessive orientation around different states, and being kind of where one state is substituted for the other, and a kind of, again, extension of the synchronic axis on the axis of combination.
Yes, definitely. And like, that's the kind of agency I think the narrator is taking, this kind of combining, selecting, both selecting and combining things, but they're combined into these lists whose like temporality is debatable in terms of narrativity. Can I look at this question?
Yeah, let me read it out so that everyone can hear it. Jane says, "A wonderful talk, thank you. One of the points I heard you making is that a key dimension with," and she corrects, within, not with, "what is called the human is an impersonality, a life," with the indefinite article, the il y a, and Stein brings that dimension to the fore. If I understand you correctly, then I wonder what, in your view, accounts for the different affective responses to having that dimension highlighted. Levinas's horror versus Stein's mood of tenderness. What broader commitments, philosophical or political or religious, of each thinker-writer do you think might account for that affective difference?
That's a really good question, and a hard one. And I'm not even sure how qualified I'm to answer in terms of Levinas, because it's interesting that like one could point to Levinas writing at this very dark historical moment, but then like, yeah, Stein is writing pretty much at the same same historical moment, and like there is, so is Stein kind of turning away from some horror of the world? And of course this is like a conversation in Stein criticisms. She's often kind of judged for like ignoring things such as like the horror of the Second World War, and sort of, I wish I remembered the quote now, but in spite of all that, saying somewhere in an interview that yes, these are all things that are happening, they're horrible, but still the world is beautiful. And that's like condemned as a failed political act. Whereas then, like, I don't know, it seems like Levinas is also, even though there is this horror, is with this how he writes about the Ilya, is celebrating the world, or if not the world, then like at least art that can bring us things. If the world, if the notion of the world is somehow like condemned because it implies this kind of objectification, they're just like yeah, they're highlighting different aspects and maybe understanding the notion of the world in different ways. But then I also don't want to speculate about the psychology of either, and I'm sure you're not really implying to that either.
You can go ahead and read what Jane says.
Yeah. So Jane suggests it might have something to do with Levinas's commitment to something profoundly special about the human subject, and Stein has a flatter ontology. Yes, definitely, that that might be it. And it just seems that for Stein, she's like, it's because she's an artist who doesn't do theory or philosophy really. She's like working with this material of words and art. She's kind of doing what Levinas is writing about that art can do, and she's just like so completely committed to that, whether it be a world or not, that is kind of already full of this non-human life, even though I'm not saying that Stein kind of precociously somehow celebrates or propagates this kind of post-anthropocentric thinking, but it's just necessarily there in the way she works. And that's how somehow, yes, I agree that she arrives at this flatter ontology. That's really interesting, but I would like to think about that question more. Thank you.
Very good. Anyone else have a question for Laura?
There's also some sources.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Oh, yeah, Jane has one more question.
Oh, I missed it. Oh, there we go.
Go
Yes, Jane, please, go ahead. We're just waiting for Jane to type her question.
Yeah, she's asking if we can.
Can I speak? I know. I wish. I don't know. Let's see what Answer Live does if I press that. You would like to answer?
Oh yeah.
You.
Oh, maybe I have to press Answer Live.
I just did it. It doesn't seem to.
But it says now technology. William Egginton is going to answer this question live. Oh, there is Jane. So.
Ah.
Hi.
Oh. Fantastic, Jane. How did you do that? Just for future reference. I would like to know how your voice was able to come through just now.
Me? I didn't do anything.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Shira. Shira has the controls. Thank you. That's great.
It's magic. Okay, well, I just wanted to say it was a really interesting talk. I wanted to ask a bit more about the use of the natural word or naturally. In particular, when there were two instances of it. Let me just see, I wrote it down on my notes. Hold on here. One was when Ida soon forgot the other addresses. She just naturally lives wherever she is, that quote. And the other one, naturally, feels natural to be in whatever dress she's in. And the second one is that she was living in Connecticut quite naturally.
Yeah.
And is that because for Stein, you kind of take on inevitably part of your milieu, like you just get used to it and it becomes like an extended body of yourself in an extreme case? And is that the sense in which, like, you know, you just forget where you are because you've partly become where you are, or what? How do you think that's functioning that naturally?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because that's like Stein's use of natural is really interesting and could have been part of this talk as well. So yeah, in a sense, it's tempting, that kind of reading, like that it was her experience, and yeah, it became like part of her, or she became part of the environment. And I think that's right. But then there's always like this meta level, I think. And the word natural is another thing that repeats a lot in this book. And I think it could be combined with this reading of like that it was natural because that's how stories go, sort of like she turned up there and then she was there and that was natural. And that's like Stein is also, it's clear that she's explicitly playing with that. There's a famous quote from her that's actually from Ida. It goes, "Nature is not natural, and that's natural enough." And so I think she's kind of trying to denaturalize nature in some ways, but still kind of at the same time she tempts us, or kind of invites us and lures us to these experiences of like, oh, it was quiet and natural, and like, yeah, in a way makes us experience that kind of connection with the environment suddenly with one word, even though the environment hasn't really been evoked except in these like very impersonal lists.
Yeah, but maybe the connection, there's a level of connection that is wholly impersonal and wholly almost unconscious. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be a connection that's like, you know, one universe, we're all part of the same thing. Not that kind of connection, just a kind of just unremarkable, it's hard to know how to say it, an unremarkable locatedness in space.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely, that's, I think, the level that's evoked, and that's really good. Like, I don't know if you're thinking about the like Whiteheadian
yeah, a little, maybe
affective tone or experience that's not really experienced.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, that it's made its presence, well, it's presencing, but you don't really pick up on it in any explicit way. But that doesn't mean it's doing nothing. Hence the word. It's just unremarkable. It's natural.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great. That's a good connection to make too.
Okay, we have another question. So Seth Forrest writes, I wonder if you might say a bit more with regard to Morton's ideas of ambient poetics. Were you influenced by those parts of his work? Full disclosure, I was one of his RAs on ecology without nature, and the idea of ambient poetics is one that I think he moved away from rather quickly on the way to OOO, etc. I always thought of the ambient poetics concept as a useful way to activate a new close reading so that a text like Ida becomes about environmentality. but I've been thinking about these things in tender buttons and are shorter pieces. Thanks, Seth.
Yes. Thank you, Seth. Really great question as well. And like something I think I write a bit more about in the article, because yeah, definitely Ecology Without Nature, Morten's book that that these quotes I used are from, or the quotes, that's where he's talking about ambient poetics. And when I was reading it in conjunction with Ida, I felt like, in a way, yes, like I think this is what Ida is doing as well, and it resonates really well. But then on the other hand, there is this tension that I maybe mentioned quickly, that Ida doesn't really, a text like Ida doesn't fit what Morten seems to be defining as environmental writing or ambient poetics either, because like the ambiences, like the sounds or other sense experiences aren't really explicitly evoked. That's like the poetics of Ida goes directly against that, in that like nothing is really described, things are listed. But what's interesting is that it seems like, at least in my reading experience, even the like very sort of cold and unambient gesture of listing does evoke something, like, and definitely maybe not listing states, but then there are these mountains and trees and rivers. So we can't read a mention of a mountain without having some sort of like recognition of an environment. And like, so I don't know, that's kind of like an open question whether that counts as ambient poetics or not, but it's really interesting. And thanks for bringing that up, or like reminding me of that.
Terrific. Thank you again, Seth, for that question.
Thank you.
And Jane adds to the chat panel that she likes the notion of ambient poetics.
Yeah, I like it as well, I should add.
Okay. Please let me know, even if someone's typing out a question right now, maybe just quickly put into the chat that you're asking a question, so that I know that you're asking. I don't want to cut anyone off at this point. Okay, and if not, then I guess again virtually join me in thanking Laura for her wonderful presentation. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and thank you, Jane and Seth, and for your questions, and the rest of you for attending and listening in today.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Bill, again for organizing this.
Our pleasure. Kira, thanks for all the technical help in getting things to work here. I still need to learn this format better. Terrific. All right.
It's a learning experience for all of us.
Learning experience, exactly. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye now. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.